Well, it's really lovely to be here as ever and talking about a picture that has to be one of my favourite paintings in the entire world, if not the National Gallery. I'm Caroline Campbell. I'm the Jacob Rothschild Head of the Curatorial Department here at the National Gallery, and I'm curator of Italian paintings before 1500. And I've known Botticelli's Venus and Mars, the subject of today's talk, for a long time before I ever had any formal connection with the National Gallery, as it was a painting when I was a student in London I used to always come and sit in front of and wonder what was going on. Because I think one of the glorious things about studying pictures as an art historian is that it's a way of combining your love for the pictures with your interest in intellectual pursuits. And what could be more appropriate to make that point than a painting which in itself is completely about love, thwarted love, undesired love, or just maybe slightly bored, prosaic, married love. So in my talk today, I want to talk about Botticelli. We all probably know who he is, but it's always worth going over things. I want to talk a bit about what's represented visually in the picture. And then I want to talk about the meaning of this painting, perhaps, or the multiple meanings, and how that's very much related to function. And finally, I want to end with thinking about how the meaning of the function of this picture has changed over the last 500 years, and what it might mean today in a public art gallery, which is very different to what it might have meant in late 15th century Florence. So, quite a lot to try and pack into half an hour. I'll do my best. So, Botticelli, Sandro Botticelli, as we know him today, is one of the most famous artists of the Italian Renaissance. In fact, you could go as far as saying that he really is thought by many of us to be the archetypal Florentine Renaissance artist, because of the subjects that he depicts, and also because of the people for whom he's working. Botticelli is very, very much a Florentine. If any of you have been to Florence, you'll see the streets of the centre of the city anyway, in very much the same way that they would have been in Botticelli's day. He grows up in the city, he's apprenticed in the city, and he spends pretty much his entire life, apart from a couple of years in Rome, working there. Now, Botticelli is somebody who's been very, very badly served, I think, by his first biographer, a man who's familiar to many of us, the infamous or celebrated, depending on your point of view, Giorgio Vasari. Now, Vasari, who's writing essentially the first history of art in the middle of the 16th century, is looking back at the 15th century, and particularly in Florence. Vasari is working in Florence. He's the court architect, the court painter, and also a great courtier of the Medici family. And he looks back at the late 15th century and Botticelli's day as being, as he says rather wonderfully, it was a place where anything was possible for men of talent under the great reign of Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, we'll unpick that a bit later, but it's a good place to start. Vasari goes on to saying that Botticelli spoils the chances that he's been given by his natural artistic gifts and also by the very illustrious patronage that he enjoys because he is too religious. For Vasari, this is always a problem if you get carried away by something and you forget the purpose of your art. So Vasari says that Botticelli, who becomes very much associated in his last years with the followers of Savonarola, the Dominican friar who briefly ran really Florence in the 1490s and was burned horrifically at the stake outside the town hall. Vasari says that Botticelli was spoiled really by that, and that his late art is not very good because it's too much about sentiment, religious sentiment, and not really about real artistic expression. But we're looking at a painting here which is painted in the period that everyone says was Botticelli's best. And that's in the 1470s and 80s, so long before he had become associated with Savonarola. And actually, I'd take real issue with the fact that that ruined his work. You can go and look at the extraordinary Mystic Nativity by Botticelli in the next room after this talk and really see for yourself what a glorious artist he was towards the end of his career too. But today my talk is not about the mystic nativity, it's about Venus and Mars. And so Botticelli, of course, is also known for being somebody who really specialized in mythological subjects. And he's most famous, I would say, for two paintings of mythological subjects, which sadly are not in the National Gallery, but in the Uffizi in Florence, the Primavera and the Birth of Venus. And this is what Botticelli's third most famous mythological painting, and it's the only one actually that's not in Italy really, and it's Venus and Mars. So the story of Venus and Mars is something which would have been familiar, I think, to all of Botticelli's potential audiences in late 15th century Florence. We sometimes today think of classical stories as being very, very erudite and things that some of us have trouble with knowing and understanding. And I'm not quite sure that's true, but it certainly wasn't the case in the 15th century. So here we have Venus, who's the goddess of love, as you know. She's at the far side of the picture from me, and she's reclining in a wooded landscape on a grassy sward with Mars, who is the god of war. Now, Mars and Venus's love was not totally licit. In fact, you could say it was totally illicit. Venus had been married to Vulcan, to Vulcan, who was the smith of the gods, who was, apart from being very, very ugly, also had problems with mobility. And they were a very, very, very ill-matched pair. Botticelli here shows a moment from the story told by many classical and subsequent authors of Venus's liaison with Mars, the god of war. And in many ways that seemed more appropriate because Mars was bellicose, he was strong, he was powerful, and he was also, like Venus, very, very beautiful. But Botticelli's painting is not absolutely like any of the stories we know of this sorry tale. In fact, what happens and what we don't see in Botticelli's painting is the denouement, the moment where Mars and Venus are discovered together. And if you know the story, you'll remember that Vulcan, who's the cuckolded husband, he makes a beautiful, beautiful and very, very, very net of very tight little chains. And it's so light that the pair who are cavorting somewhere don't realize that it's falling upon them. And so they are caught literally in the act. And then Vulcan calls all the gods of the pantheon of Olympus from Jupiter himself to come and look at the sorry pair and to laugh at them, so their infamy is exposed to everybody. Interestingly, of course, that's not the moment that Botticelli chooses to depict in this picture. When you look at it, you think that actually they're engaged in a perfectly pleasant and perfectly normal and not illicit activity. So what's happening is that they're both seated together, they're both lying on the ground, but in very different ways. Venus, who's at the far side of the painting, is looking incredibly beautiful and incredibly regal in profile. She's wearing the most extraordinary costume. I've always been fascinated by the fact that in this representation of Venus, her hair has become part of her jewelry. It's hard to see how they separate. Her plaits become part of the jewels around her. And thus Botticelli is depicting a costume which it would have been absolutely impossible to wear and certainly impossible to take off, which we have to imagine happens somewhere in the story of Mars and Venus. So he loves playing with these things which are impossible in his work. So Venus looks very regal, she looks very bossy. She also looks as if she's totally uninterested in Mars, her lover. Mars, I think, is intended to make us laugh. You can see that whereas Venus is very much in control of her body, even in a very strange position of crossing one leg over another, which frankly is impossible to hold because I've tried it, and it doesn't seem to fit with any sort of known knowledge of the human body. Mars is absolutely lost in another world, and he's not lost perhaps in the world of contemplation, he's lost in the world of sleep. You can see that he's actually snoring, or we believe that he is. I mean, what's so clever about Botticelli's painting is that he conveys the sense of noise and through something which is purely visual. We feel that we can almost hear the noise that Mars is making. And he's making so much noise and he's so lost in sleep that absolutely nothing is able to wake him up. And that's what's happening in the background of the picture. You may be able to see these naughty little boys who are playing with his armor. They've got his lance, which of course he would use to try and, run people down on a horse. They've got his helmet. They're crawling in and out of his armor. One of them is leering at us, the audience, through the armor. They are really quite repellent, but they are also very, very, very funny. And so all of this is happening. You can imagine the cacophony in the painting as all this clanking metal is moved around. Venus is totally unmoved because she's perfect, she's beyond everything, and Mars is just lost in sleep. Something else that I think he also shows how totally abandoned he is a detail just next to me where I'm standing in the painting. You might be able to see that there's a tree trunk and that there are a couple of buzzing insects who seem to be wasps, and that's significant. I'll come back to that later too. And as all of us know, if you sit somewhere, if you're having a lovely summer picnic and you suddenly find a wasp, you generally get up pretty sharpish if you're shocked, and you might be stung. And so you can imagine that that almost might be the next episode in this painting. If Mars wakes up, he's not only going to think, what is happening with my armor, but he's going to be stung by a wasp very unpleasantly in his ear. And the one thing I haven't mentioned, of course, the other noisy thing, is the conch shell. So one of these little putti, little cupids, also has a great shell in their hand, and they are blowing this into Mars's other ear. So one ear, he's got to be aware of the wasps, and the other ear, he's about to have a terrible noise. So Botticelli's painting is showing this in a moment of suspended animation. We, the viewer, know what's going to happen next, or at least we can imagine what's going to happen next. But Botticelli very cleverly doesn't actually show that to us. So it's a painting of extraordinary humor. It's also a painting of great humanity. Of course, these are meant to be gods, but they're behaving in a very, very human and very believable fashion. Something else that you might all know about Botticelli is that he's very much associated with what are very, very sophisticated intellectual circles in late 15th century Florence. He worked substantially for the Medici family. He's particularly associated with a group of artists around Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the leader of the Medici family in the late 15th century and was the de facto ruler of Florence. Lorenzo wasn't actually the ruler of Florence. One very interesting 15th century text calls him the master of the workshop, which really, particularly when looking at paintings, I always think is appropriate, but it's intended to show, I think, that Lorenzo was in charge, but he was only in charge there because people allowed him to be there. And he wasn't a king, he wasn't a prince. He very much wanted to be, but that wasn't possible within the confines of Republican Florence. But Lorenzo, apart from having this quasi-regal court, of which Botticelli is an important member, is very, very interested in great intellectual developments. One's associated particularly with something called Neoplatonism or New Platonism, which was really humanist ideas which combined the classical world with the Christian present and made sense, combined these two worldviews together. Botticelli is often said to be very closely part of this circle, and not just as the way of providing art for the Medici and their associates, but also because of his proximity to the intellectuals, to the humanist scholars who were also part of this world, particularly an individual called Poliziano, or Politian, who was the tutor to Lorenzo de' Medici's children, and was a great scholar, but also was a great poet. And what I think is very interesting about paintings like Venus and Mars is that, like the poetry of Politian, and also the poetry indeed of Lorenzo de' Medici, who writes some of the most beautiful vernacular poetry in the Italian language in the 15th century, this painting is not just about classicism, it's not just about contemporary poetry, but it combines them all in a way that is absolutely digestible, even if you don't know anything about these stories. So these paintings, in a way, can be read on all sorts of levels. They can be read as very classical, erudite descriptions of texts, and I'll tell you a bit about the text that these may describe, but it's also about something which everybody would really understand, because it's about a story and a moment that really is quite key to human existence, falling in love. So a little bit about the intellectual possible sources for this picture. This is a type of art history that was very, very popular in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, led by the great scholar E.H. Gombrich, who wrote The Story of Art, but was also the director of the Warburg Institute, about half an hour's walk from here in London, for much of the later 20th century. Gombrich was very interested, as were many of his pupils, in the idea that you had to explain a painting like this by its intellectual sources, and that you couldn't see a painting like Venus and Mars really outside the context of Neoplatonism and of texts that would have been known to very, very few people. What he and others noticed was that there are certain details of this picture which do seem to respond to a rather obscure ancient text. And that's a description by the poet Lucian of the marriage of Alexander, who of course was the great Macedonian emperor. He went as far as conquering India briefly, and Roxanne, or Roxana, one of his wives. And one of the descriptions by Lucian of their wedding says that there were all these putti, or little cupids, in the background who were playing with his armour. Now, this is a very unusual motif to find in painting, and thus it's quite likely that Botticelli knew this, or one of the people who talked to him about the subject, maybe Politian, actually knew about. But what I think is important to say, that maybe having this reading of the painting doesn't negate any of the others, and you can also connect it very strongly to Florentine poetry of the late 15th century, and also to a strong visual culture, and a world in which stories like Venus and Mars were known by everybody. About 15 years ago, when I was a PhD student, I was very, very interested in reading Florentine story collections, accounts that people made for themselves of tales they liked. These are sometimes called zibaldone. Sometimes they're records of their daily life, but often they're just records of stories that they know. And Venus and Mars is something which comes up in those. So it was something that was really part of a more popular culture, as well as an intellectual one. And this is also something which is often connected to Lorenzo de' Medici and the way in which he ruled Florence, not as a ruler, but as somebody who was in charge, that he was really trying to combine more intellectual and more prosaic popular worlds in his work, and also in the artists who he supported, of whom Botticelli is absolutely forefront. But I think I've talked enough about that. I want to move on to thinking about what this picture would have meant in its original context. And it's always very, very fascinating to try and work out where a picture actually was. In many ways, it's absolutely impossible, because often paintings don't really have any history between, say, the time that they were made and the 19th century, when they were often first collected and came into museums such as ours in the National Gallery. But in the case of Venus and Mars, we're able to make enough ideas about where this picture came from to be pretty certain that it was made, from the visual evidence of the picture, to suppose that this was made for a family called the Vespucci. And there are several things which give us clue to that. One is a description in Giorgio Vasari's Life of Botticelli, which is in the second age of his lives. Vasari divides his lives of the artists, of the old contemporary painters, into 3 lives. Those who were really quite rubbish but were trying quite hard, that's the first age. Those who were really trying very hard but couldn't strive to absolute excellence because they were too interested in details and in getting things right, and Botticelli belongs to this. And then the third age, which is exemplified by Michelangelo, by Leonardo and by Raphael, where artists allied great study with a sense of divine perfection. So Botticelli comes in the second age of the striving but not quite getting there. And Botticelli's work was clearly quite well known to Vasari, and he describes a number of Florentine houses where you could see his work. And he says that there were a number of paintings by him in the house of the Vespucci family. And it's not absolutely clear that that was this painting, but what is interesting that the wasps that I pointed out to you a few minutes earlier, wasps in Italian is vespe, vespe, Vespucci. It's not very far away in terms of the language. So I think it's quite possible, because painters are often putting puns, amusing things into pictures, which give something for the patrons to look at, that this actually is a painting for the Vespucci family. And this sort of visual joke I think is very charming and funny. So even if we're not certain that it's for the Vespucci, we can be certain of the sort of room in which this picture was displayed. And the thing that really gives this away is the dimension or the shape of this picture. You may have noticed, standing in this room, that this painting has rather unusual rectangular proportions. And you may also have noticed that quite a lot of the other pictures in this room have these proportions too. And they belong, a lot of them, to a category of painting called the Spalliera. And Spalliera means a painting that might be at the level of your shoulders or your spalle. So they were quite high up. And it seems that these paintings are seen as being windows into another world. They were set into the paneling of rooms, we suppose. We actually have none that have survived in their original context. We have inventory descriptions, but that's about it. But that's how they seem to have been. And they were not just in any room, but they were in a particular room in Florentine palaces. And if you start going around galleries, the National Gallery, the Courtauld Gallery up the road, and all sorts of collections of Italian Renaissance painting worldwide, you'll notice quite a lot of these strange rectangular paintings. And they are really one of the first types of secular painting that exist. Sometimes they were made for chests, and in fact we've got a chest underneath this, so you can see that, and you can also see that the dimensions are quite different. Paintings for chests are normally smaller, they're much more like the size of this picture. Paintings for Spalliere are rectangular, but they're big like this. It's sometimes thought that they hung over chests, and that may have been the case, but they're also used as part of really quite complicated iconographical ensemble in rooms. And these paintings are not just made for any old place in a Florentine palace. They're made for a particular room called the camera, or the chamber. Often in English, this is mistranslated as bedchamber. But what's interesting about the camera is that it's a multi-purpose room. It is a room in which people slept, and indeed the main camera in a patrician palace might well be where a husband would sleep with his wife on the occasions they wanted to conceive a child, a legitimate child within wedlock. They might also be used as places where people who were particularly important to you and who you particularly wanted to impress would come, so you could show them the wonderful objects that were kept there. Because camerae weren't just rooms where there were great paintings, and actually they generally had a mixture of secular paintings, religious paintings, particularly tondi or round paintings, often of the Virgin and Child, and also portraits of members of the family too. And in the display in this room here, room 58 in the National Gallery, we've tried to give a little bit of sense of the types of objects you might expect to find in a camera around a painting such as Venus and Mars. So these were multi-purpose rooms. They were rooms where people wanted to show off, a patron might show off, but within a particular context that he controlled, and I very specifically say he, and that he could control the access to. But the paintings often in this room were associated in some way with marriage. Chests, such as the example you see here, were generally commissioned at the time of marriage by the man as a gift, not as a gift to his wife, but to welcome her into the house. And it's possible that these types of paintings were as well too. And I think, thinking about that, about Venus and Mars being in a space where, if it belonged to the Vespucci, was an intellectual household, but also somewhere where people really valued art as being something that represented things important about themselves and their identity, but also to their family life, offers a number of keys to unlocking this picture. Because this is a picture that is, of course, about love. And I told you the story of Venus and Mars. But what I also pointed out, I think, at the beginning, is that this is a very different representation of Venus and Mars to what we might expect from the story. Everything seems totally within the bounds of sort of marriage and also of chastity. This is a very, very chaste and demure Venus. She's very, very well covered. You might notice that her foot is bared, but her body is very well protected by her clothing and even by her hair. So what seems is that this picture might have been made at the time of the patron's marriage. It was also thought that if women looked at beautiful things at the time of marriage, particularly of beautiful men, often it's said to be beautiful babies rather than men like Mars, but of course there are babies here, it would increase their likelihood of conceiving a male child, which I have to say, unfortunately, was of course the point of a marriage in late 15th century Florence. Girls were only valued insofar that they could be part of a marriage alliance, but actually when a girl was born, it was always thought to be a shame and a disappointment, and sometimes women were really blamed for this fact. So this picture may have been made to encourage the young bride, the young woman, to be able to produce proper male heirs. But I wanted to conclude by saying I've talked about all sorts of ways in which you could look at this painting according to intellectual ideas, ideas of classicism, of humanism, and also of the roles of men and women within family life in Renaissance Florence. But I think as historians, we often forget that people lived lives that were also about humour and about fun and about, amusement in the same way that we do today. And what I love about this painting is that it's an incredibly humorous, amusing, and timeless representation of a subject that however much or however little we know about the story of Venus and Mars, however little we know about Botticelli, or indeed his patrons, there's something that really strikes at our core of our humanity. And that's why it's great to be able to study this picture, but it's also just great to be able to look at it as something which is able to cross the boundaries of time and mean something in the late 15th century, and also mean a great deal to us today. Thank you.